Hello and welcome to Stories at Night. Make yourself comfortable, allow your body to relax, and let your breathing become slow and steady. This story is meant for a quiet evening and gentle drifting into sleep. You don't need to remember every word, just follow the calm flow of the narration. Tonight, the story will take you into the past, to a city that was once the center of the world, and then slowly became its shadow. The story is told in the third person, unhurried and soft. If you are ready, let the night begin. Fog drifted slowly over the Bosphorus. It rose from the water and spread along the shores, wrapping stone and wood alike, softening the outlines of the city. Domes and towers appeared and vanished, as if Constantinople were not standing on solid ground, but floating somewhere between sleep and waking. The city awoke cautiously. Morning sounds were muted. The rare creak of wheels, the splash of water near the piers, quiet footsteps. Between these sounds lingered silence, dense and watchful. Within it lived a sense of waiting, as though the city itself were listening. Constantinople was still vast in size, but no longer in feeling. Its walls stood firm, its churches rose high, yet something inside had changed. Confidence had faded, leaving behind only habit and endurance. The city resembled an old house that had not yet collapsed, but whose beams creaked and whose rooms held a chill. Along one of the streets walked a man named Manuel. He was a scribe at a monastery, accustomed to quiet things, the rustle of parchment, the scent of wax, the steady glow of oil lamps. He did not seek attention or change. In times like these, such restraint was not weakness but survival. The stone pavement beneath his feet had been worn smooth by countless steps. Grass pushed through the cracks between the slabs. Houses lined the street, some sturdy and dark, others half-ruined, their windows hollow and empty. In a few, life still lingered. Women stepped outside carrying water jars. Children crossed the street quickly, disappearing between buildings, as though they knew it was best not to remain visible for long. Manuel was heading toward the harbor. He had been tasked with collecting crates of wax and paper delivered by a merchant ship. Once, such an errand would have been routine. Now even a simple walk required attention. He passed a wide square where crowds had once gathered. Now it felt abandoned. Dust covered the stone, water pooled in the cracks, and beneath the grime faint traces of mosaic could still be seen. Occasionally, a fragment caught the light and shimmered softly, like a memory unwilling to fade. At the edge of the square stood a statue. Its face was gone, not shattered in anger, but carefully erased, as if time itself had chosen to leave the body without remembrance. Wind passed through the empty eye sockets, and it seemed as though the city exhaled its weariness through them. Guards stood watch at the gates. Their posture appeared relaxed, yet their eyes were tense. They let Manuel pass without a word, but he felt their brief attention linger on him. The attention of men who no longer trusted walls or routines. The harbor greeted him with the smells of salt, fish, and tar. It was louder here, yet the noise lacked harmony. Voices in many languages overlapped without blending. Foreign merchants stood apart, confident and composed, as though they always had a way out. Manuel received the crates without delay. Their weight was solid and understandable. It brought an unusual sense of calm, rare in a city where so much had become uncertain. As he prepared to leave, a boy near the edge of the pier caught his attention. Barefoot and dressed in clothing too large for him, the boy stood motionless, watching people. His gaze was focused and alert, not childlike. He made no gestures and drew no attention, yet his presence felt strangely distinct. When Manuel turned toward the city, he noticed the boy nearby. No words were spoken, no movements were made, and yet, in that brief closeness, there was a quiet sense of warning, subtle and unexplainable, as if the city itself had whispered a suggestion. Manuel slowed his pace. He altered his direction and chose a longer route, without offering himself any explanation. The decision was simple and nearly unnoticed, yet it carried the caution that Constantinople had taught its inhabitants. When he looked back, the boy was gone. The crowd had closed in again. The harbor continued its restless life. but the feeling remained, light, cold, like a shadow. He did not take the shorter path. Only later did he realize this was his first conscious refusal to trust old routes in a city that was quietly changing. When Manuel reached the monastery, the fog still hovered above the water. The city looked softened and muted, as though shaped for sleep. He slowed his steps, as if afraid to awaken not only the streets, but time itself. Constantinople continued to exist, not loudly, not confidently, but as long as there were people who remained attentive, the city was not yet lost. Morning entered Constantinople quietly. It did not arrive with brightness or promise, but slipped between buildings, pale and hesitant, as if unsure it was welcome. The fog had thinned, yet the air remained heavy, carrying the scent of damp stone and old smoke. Manuel left the monastery after sunrise. His steps were unhurried. There was no need to rush. In this city, haste rarely led anywhere safe. The streets were already awake, though their awakening felt restrained, like a held breath. As he walked, he began to notice the doors. At first, they seemed ordinary, wooden, worn by time, scarred by weather. But then the marks became visible. Chalk lines, simple symbols, crosses drawn quickly, numbers written unevenly, shapes without clear meaning. They appeared on door frames, shutters, sometimes directly on stone walls beside entrances. Manuel slowed his pace. Each mark carried weight, though none explained itself. Some were faint, as if made hastily and meant to be temporary. Others were bold, freshly drawn, standing out against dark wood and stone. The city, it seemed, had begun to label itself. He passed a narrow house where a faded cross marked the door. The building looked quiet, almost empty. A few steps farther, another door bore a sequence of numbers. Nearby, a symbol had been half erased, smeared by rain or an uncertain hand. These signs were not decoration. They were messages, silent ones, left for those who knew how to read them. Manuel did not know all their meanings, but he understood enough. Some marks warned of illness inside. Others showed that payments had been made, that collectors had already passed through. Some signaled loyalty, others submission. In a city where authority had grown inconsistent, people had learned to communicate quietly, without words. The streets themselves reflected this change. Markets were open, but voices were low. Merchants displayed their goods carefully, not lavishly. Bread was measured. Grain was watched closely. Coins passed from hand to hand with reluctance, as if each exchange carried risk. Manuel observed faces as he walked. They were attentive, guarded. People looked at one another briefly, then away. Recognition existed, but trust was rare. Familiarity no longer meant safety. He turned into a narrower street where sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Here the marks were more frequent. Nearly every door carried something. Some sign, some trace of a decision made quietly, perhaps in fear, perhaps in calculation. A woman stepped out of one house, adjusting a shawl around her shoulders. She glanced at the symbol on her door before leaving, as if reassuring herself it was still there. Only then did she walk on. Further along, Manuel noticed a door with no mark at all. It stood bare among the others, unclaimed. The wood was old, the handle rusted. No one entered or exited. The absence felt deliberate, almost louder than any symbol. In that emptiness, Manuel sensed another truth of the city. Not everyone chose to speak, even in signs. Some remained invisible, hoping invisibility itself would protect them. As the morning advanced, the streets grew slightly busier. Yet the feeling did not lift. Constantinople moved like a body conserving energy, unsure how much strength it would need before nightfall. Manuel reached a small square bordered by workshops. Craftsmen worked quietly. Tools struck wood and metal in steady rhythms, grounding sounds that felt older than fear. These were the sounds of survival, not ambition. Even here, the marks appeared. A carpenter's door bore a simple line scratched into the frame. A potter's shop displayed a faint symbol near the threshold. Each trade, each household had adapted to the same unspoken language. Manuel understood now that the city had fragmented, not physically but inwardly. Where once law and order had flowed outward from the center, now control existed in pockets. Street by street, door by door, mark by mark, he continued walking, letting his thoughts drift slowly, deliberately. This was not a matter to solve, only to observe. The city did not ask for answers. It asked for awareness. By the time he returned toward the monastery, the sun had risen higher, though its warmth remained distant. The fog had retreated to the water, leaving the streets exposed and unchanged. Manuel paused once more, looking at a row of doors, each bearing a different sign. Together, they formed a quiet record of the city's condition, not written in books, but drawn by trembling hands in chalk. Constantinople was no longer unified by its walls alone. It was held together by small choices, cautious gestures, and silent agreements made at thresholds. Manuel resumed his walk. He carried no mark with him, no symbol to declare safety or allegiance. Only attention. And in a city like this, attention was becoming the most valuable protection of all. By evening, the harbor changed its tone. The daylight faded gently, and the water darkened, turning heavy and reflective. The air cooled, carrying the scent of salt and distant smoke. Constantinople always felt different near sunset, as if the city exhaled and grew quieter all at once. Manuel returned to the waterfront as the first lamps were being lit. He did not come for an errand this time. His steps carried no urgency. He walked simply to observe, to let the rhythm of the harbor slow his thoughts. Ships rested along the piers, their hulls dark against the water. Ropes creaked softly. Sails were furled, shadows folded into themselves. Above the decks, small lights began to appear. Steady, deliberate, foreign. These lights were not scattered or uncertain. They were placed carefully, evenly spaced, controlled. They belonged to ships that did not fear the night. Manuel stood at a distance and watched them multiply. One by one, lamps glowed aboard vessels flying unfamiliar banners. Their reflections stretched across the water like thin paths of fire, trembling but unbroken. The local boats remained darker. Their lanterns were fewer, dimmer, shielded from the wind. The difference was subtle yet unmistakable. It spoke of resources, of preparation, of confidence that no longer resided fully within the city. Around him, people moved slowly along the quay. Sailors unloaded goods with practiced motions. Merchants counted crates and sacks, their attention focused inward. The harbor was busy, but it was a contained busyness. Measured, cautious, restrained. Manuel noticed how groups formed naturally. Foreign traders stood close to their ships, speaking among themselves in low voices. They rarely strayed far from their cargo or from one another. Local workers passed between them, careful and efficient, avoiding unnecessary contact. The harbor had become a meeting place not of cultures, but of boundaries. From where Manuel stood, the walls of the city rose behind him, dark and solid. Once they had symbolized protection and permanence. Now they felt like the edge of something, an outline rather than a guarantee. The lights on the ships continued to glow. They did not flicker. They did not waver. Even the wind failed to disturb them. Their steadiness contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that had settled over the city's streets. Manuel felt no anger, only a quiet awareness. These ships did not threaten the city by force. They threatened it by endurance. They came prepared, patient, capable of waiting longer than Constantinople could. As night deepened, the harbor grew calmer. Movements slowed. Tasks ended. Voices faded. Yet the foreign lights remained, unchanged, their reflections stretching farther across the water as darkness thickened. Manuel realized that the harbor was no longer simply a place of trade. It had become a mirror. In it, the city could see its own condition reflected back, its hesitation, its dependency, its fading authority. He turned away from the water and began to walk back toward the streets. The glow of the ships stayed with him, lingering at the edge of his vision even as buildings blocked the view. The city behind the harbor was darker. Lanterns burned low. Windows remained shuttered. Doors stayed closed longer than before. The marks he had noticed earlier were harder to see at night, but their presence was felt all the same. Manuel moved slowly, letting the quiet settle. He did not hurry. There was no advantage in reaching home quickly when the night itself was patient. Behind him, beyond the walls, the harbor continued to shine. Those lights would last through the night. They would burn until morning, steady and watchful. Constantinople, by contrast, prepared itself for sleep. Not restful sleep, but the kind that comes from exhaustion. A sleep filled with half-awareness, where even rest remained cautious. Manuel disappeared into the narrow streets, carrying the image of those distant lights with him. They did not frighten him. They reminded him. The city was no longer the brightest presence on its own waters. Night settled gently over Constantinople. It did not arrive suddenly, but spread slowly, filling streets and courtyards, softening edges and dimming colors. The city seemed to fold inward, as though conserving what little warmth and certainty it still possessed. Manuel remained awake longer than usual. From the small window of the monastery, he observed the city's quiet transformation. Lamps were extinguished one by one. Windows darkened. Doors closed with care, each sound measured, each movement deliberate. Inside the walls, shadows grew longer. They collected in narrow streets, beneath archways, along the bases of ancient buildings. These shadows were not threatening on their own. They simply existed, patient and unnoticed, like things that had learned to wait. As the hours passed, the city changed its behavior. Footsteps became rarer. The few figures still moving did so with purpose, never lingering. The sense of community that daylight suggested dissolved into individual paths and private concerns. Manuel thought of how different the city must have been once. A place where night brought gatherings, voices, music drifting from open spaces. Now the darkness brought separation. Each household retreated into itself, forming small islands of safety surrounded by uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the monastery walls, a door closed more firmly than others. The sound carried farther than expected, echoing briefly before fading. The city absorbed it without response. Disappearance had become subtle. People no longer vanished in dramatic ways. There were no sudden alarms, no public scenes. Instead, absence appeared quietly. A shop that did not open. A familiar figure no longer present at the market. A window that remained dark day after day. Manuel noticed these changes not all at once, but gradually. The city taught its observers patience. It revealed its losses slowly, as if allowing time to adjust. Even the guards behaved differently at night. Their presence was reduced, their movements restrained. They stood at familiar points, but their vigilance felt symbolic rather than active. They watched not because they believed they could prevent everything, but because being seen still mattered. Within the walls, authority had grown thin. Not gone, but stretched. Power existed in fragments, in temporary agreements and quiet understandings. Order was maintained not by law alone, but by habit and fear. Manuel lay down as the night deepened. Sleep came in waves, interrupted but gentle. His thoughts drifted without urgency, carried by the city's subdued rhythm. At times, a distant sound reached him. A muffled step, the rustle of fabric, the soft scrape of something being moved. None of it demanded attention. These were ordinary noises, yet in this city, even ordinary sounds carried weight. The walls themselves seemed to listen. Built to protect, they now served another purpose. They contained. They held in not only people but uncertainty. Whatever happened within them remained enclosed, unseen by the world beyond. Manuel sensed that this was the true change. The city had not become more dangerous in obvious ways. It had become quieter about its dangers. Fear no longer announced itself. It blended into routine. As the night approached its deepest hour, the city settled further. Breathing slowed. Movement ceased almost entirely. Constantinople did not sleep deeply. It rested lightly, prepared to wake at the slightest disturbance. When dawn eventually came, it would reveal nothing dramatic. The streets would look much the same. Buildings would stand as they always had. Only those who paid close attention would notice what was missing. Manuel closed his eyes. Within the walls, shadows remained. Not as enemies, but as signs, markers of a city learning how to exist with less certainty than before. Morning returned without celebration. Light reached the city gently, slipping between buildings and settling on stone that had grown accustomed to restraint. The night left behind no clear boundary, only a gradual shift from darkness to gray. Manuel walked through the streets as the city resumed its quiet movement. Shops opened carefully. Workers appeared in measured numbers. Life continued, though without enthusiasm, as if everyone waited for something that had not yet arrived. The rumor moved before it was spoken. It passed through the city like a change in air pressure, unseen yet felt. No single voice carried it. No moment marked its arrival. Instead, it emerged in glances, in hesitation, in the way people paused before continuing their tasks. Manuel sensed it near the markets. Merchants stood closer to their goods. Transactions were brief. Weight was given to silence rather than conversation. Information traveled indirectly, carried by absence and implication. The East had always been present in the city's imagination. A direction associated with distance, with change, with powers that rose quietly and moved with patience. Now that presence felt closer, no longer abstract. Along the streets, signs of preparation appeared. Not formal defenses, not visible fortifications, but small personal measures. Supplies stored more carefully. Tools kept within reach. Routes memorized and adjusted. Manuel noticed how people walked differently. Their movements suggested calculation. They chose paths that allowed visibility. Corners were approached slowly. The city's geography had become a mental map of safety and risk. The rumor carried no details. There were no dates, no numbers, no names that could be confirmed. The strength lay in its vagueness. It did not demand action. It demanded awareness. In the past, threats had been announced. Messengers arrived. Decrees were issued. The city prepared together. Now preparation was individual. Each household weighed its own choices, its own thresholds. Manuel passed a row of workshops where work continued steadily. The sound of tools remained constant, grounding. Craft endured where politics faded. These rhythms felt older than fear, reminders that daily labor persisted regardless of uncertainty. Yet even here, caution was visible. Supplies were not left unattended. Doors were closed more quickly. Windows were watched. The rumor did not disrupt life. It reshaped it. Manuel understood that the city had entered a state between events. Nothing had happened, yet everything felt altered. The absence of confirmation created a space where imagination filled the gaps. He felt no panic, only a quiet adjustment, a sense that the city was learning to exist alongside anticipation. As the day progressed, the rumor settled deeper. It became part of the city's background, like the sound of water or wind. People adapted without acknowledgement, folding uncertainty into routine. By late afternoon, the streets grew quieter again, not because of fear alone, but because energy was being conserved. Constantinople moved carefully, as though preparing for a future that remained undefined. Manuel returned toward the monastery. He carried nothing new, yet felt the weight of something intangible. The rumor did not follow him. It had already arrived. From within the city's walls, the East remained unseen. And that, perhaps, was what gave the rumor its power. Constantinople had always believed itself prepared. Now it learned the patience of waiting. The day moved slowly across Constantinople. Light shifted from one side of the city to the other, tracing familiar paths that no longer felt fully inhabited. Manuel followed these paths, allowing the quiet to guide him. He passed through one of the great squares near the heart of the city. Once it had been a place of ceremony and gathering. Now it stood open and still, its wide stone surface exposed to the sky. Footsteps crossed it without lingering. The space felt larger than before, not because it had grown, but because fewer people remained to fill it. Manuel paused at the edge of the square. From there, The scale of the city's past became visible. Columns rose where crowds had once gathered. Broken fragments rested where banners had flown. The air carried no echoes, only the suggestion that sound had once mattered here. The buildings surrounding the square bore marks of endurance. Stone had darkened with age. Decorations had softened, losing definition. What remained was structure without ornament, function without celebration. Manuel moved slowly across the open space. His steps felt small against the breadth of stone. Each sound he made stood out briefly before dissolving into stillness. At the center of the square stood a monument. Its surface was worn smooth, its inscriptions barely legible. Time had reduced intention to texture. Whatever meaning it once held now belonged to memory rather than understanding. The emptiness was not absolute. A few figures crossed the square at measured intervals. They avoided the center, favoring the edges, as if wide openness had become unfamiliar. Manuel noticed how the city no longer used its largest spaces. What had once unified now dispersed. Life retreated into narrower streets, smaller rooms, more controllable environments. The square felt exposed. In the past, openness had represented strength. Now it suggested vulnerability. Too much visibility left no place to withdraw, no corner to observe from safety. Manuel reached the far side of the square and stopped again. He turned, taking in the full view one last time. The space was unchanged in form, yet altered in function. It had become a reminder rather than a center. As he continued walking, he encountered smaller plazas and courtyards. These remained active. People gathered briefly, exchanged goods, then moved on. Compact spaces felt safer. Contained areas allowed for awareness. The city had adapted its movement patterns. Wide routes were avoided when possible. Narrow passages, once inconvenient, now provided comfort. Manuel understood that this shift was unconscious. No one had instructed it. It emerged naturally, guided by experience rather than decree. By late afternoon, the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the empty square behind him. The light emphasized absence more than presence, stretching silhouettes where crowds had once stood. Manuel returned toward the monastery with a steady pace. The city felt quieter, not in sound, but in intention. Its energy no longer reached outward, turned inward, conserving itself. Constantinople still stood. Its squares remained, but their emptiness told a story that stone alone could not hide. The harbor appeared different in daylight. Without fog or darkness, its outlines were clear, almost ordinary. Yet beneath that clarity lingered the same restrained tension that had settled over the city. Manuel returned there not out of necessity, but because certain impressions did not fade on their own. He walked along the edge of the water, keeping a measured pace. Ships rested quietly, their hulls rocking gently. Nets lay coiled. Barrels stood stacked with care. Everything was in its place, yet nothing felt entirely at ease. Manuel's attention drifted toward the quieter corners of the harbor. Places where movement was minimal, where people passed through without stopping. These areas carried a different weight, less noise, more awareness. Near one of the piers, he noticed a familiar presence. The boy stood apart from the activity, close to a bundle of fishing nets. He appeared much as before, barefoot, still, attentive. He did not interact with anyone, nor did anyone seem to notice him. His posture suggested patience rather than waiting. Manuel did not approach directly. He continued walking, observing from a distance. The boy's focus shifted constantly, following sailors, merchants, workers. His gaze moved with purpose, noting patterns, changes, interruptions. There was something practiced in the way he watched. Not curiosity, but assessment. The harbor, for him, was not a place of wonder. It was a system to be read. Manuel realized then that the city had shaped its youngest inhabitants differently. Children here learned not only routes and shortcuts, but moods and signals. They learned when to disappear, when to remain visible, and when to be still. The boy moved suddenly, weaving through a group of workers and vanishing behind a stack of crates. A moment later, He reappeared farther down the pier, unhurried, unnoticed. His movements blended seamlessly into the harbor's rhythm. Manuel felt no urge to follow. Observation was enough. Some understandings required distance. The boy's presence did not suggest danger. It suggested adaptation. Where institutions weakened, awareness strengthened. Where authority thinned, attention became protection. As Manuel continued along the waterfront, he noticed other children scattered throughout the harbor. None behaved like visitors. They did not play. They watched. They adjusted their paths instinctively, avoiding certain areas, lingering near others. The city, it seemed, taught its lessons early. Manuel turned away from the water and looked back toward the streets. The harbor lay behind him, busy yet subdued. The boy remained near the nets, unmoving now, his outline small against the larger structures. The image settled into Manuel's thoughts. Constantinople had not lost all its defenses. Some had simply changed form. As he left the harbor, the city absorbed him once more. The narrow streets felt familiar, contained. Life continued at its careful pace. Behind him, the boy remained where he was, watching, learning, enduring. And in that quiet vigilance, the city's future took shape without ceremony or announcement. The first sign came not as sound, but as scent. A thin trace of smoke drifted through the streets, barely noticeable at first, blending with the familiar smells of stone, dust, and cooking fires. Carried no urgency, only presence. Manuel noticed it while walking near a row of bakeries. Warm air escaped through low windows, carrying the comforting smell of bread. The contrast was subtle but distinct, smoke and warmth, unease and routine. The city did not react immediately. People continued their movements, slower than before but steady. A few glanced upward, toward rooftops and narrow alleys where smoke might collect. No one stopped. No one hurried. Constantinople had learned restraint even in uncertainty. As Manuel moved closer to the source, the scent thickened slightly. Not the sharp smoke of destruction, but the heavier smell of something burning longer than intended. Wood, perhaps. Cloth. Nothing sudden. Nothing dramatic. He reached a narrow street where the air grew warmer. A faint haze hovered near the upper floors of the buildings. It softened the light, blurring edges and shadows. Residents emerged quietly from doorways. They carried small items, bundles of cloth, containers, tools. Movements were deliberate. There was no panic. Each action seemed rehearsed, shaped by experience rather than instruction. The fire remained contained. Somewhere within the block, flames worked slowly, hidden behind walls and beams. The city absorbed the threat without spectacle. Water appeared. Buckets moved from hand to hand. The rhythm was calm, repetitive, grounding. Manuel observed from the side, neither advancing nor retreating. The scene unfolded without command or chaos. People understood their roles instinctively. The smell of bread persisted. Bakeries continued their work, ovens still warm, loaves still forming. The city did not allow the interruption to grow larger than necessary. Life adjusted around the disturbance, bending but not breaking. As the smoke thinned, the haze lifted. Darkened wood and damp stone marked the site, but the street remained standing. The fire had passed without claiming more than a small portion of space. Gradually, people returned indoors. Items were set back in place. Doors closed softly. The street resumed its quiet pattern. Manuel continued on his way. What lingered was not fear, but awareness. The fire had not frightened the city. It had reminded it. Constantinople survived not through strength alone, but through measured response, through restraint, through the ability to contain rather than confront. As evening approached, the smell of smoke faded completely. Only the warmth of bread remained, drifting gently through the streets. Manuel walked beneath the softening sky, feeling the city settle once more. The disturbance had passed. The rhythm endured. And in that endurance, Constantinople revealed another layer of its quiet resilience. The Latin Quarter lay close to the harbor, yet felt distant from the rest of the city. Its streets were narrower, more orderly. Stone appeared cleaner here, less worn by time. Buildings stood closer together, forming a sense of enclosure that felt intentional rather than accidental. Manuel entered the quarter slowly. The transition was subtle but unmistakable. Sounds changed. Footsteps echoed differently. The air carried fewer scents of smoke and damp stone, replaced by oil, leather, and imported goods. Light behaved differently here. Lamps were brighter, more numerous. Windows remained open longer into the evening. The streets did not retreat from night as quickly as the rest of Constantinople. Confidence lingered in small details, in the steadiness of light, in the maintenance of walls, in the way doors closed without haste. Movement within the quarter was contained. People walked with purpose, rarely straying from familiar routes. Groups formed and dissolved efficiently. There was little idle wandering. Everything appeared structured, managed, watched. Manuel observed how goods were handled. Crates were stacked neatly. Ledgers were kept close. Transactions occurred without spectacle, precise and measured. The quarter functioned as a self-sustaining system, insulated from the uncertainty beyond its borders. The city's walls felt different here as well. Not as protection, but as boundary. The quarter did not rely on the larger city for safety. It relied on organization. Manuel sensed no hostility, only separation. The Latin quarter did not dominate Constantinople. It existed alongside it, parallel rather than integrated. Its strength lay in preparation and cohesion, not in numbers or history. As Manuel moved deeper, he noticed the absence of certain signs. The chalk marks he had seen elsewhere were rare here. Doors stood unmarked, their meaning understood without symbols. Authority was implicit rather than improvised. The quarter felt quieter, yet not subdued. Silence here suggested control, not fear. Manuel paused near a narrow intersection. From this point, the contrast became clear. Beyond the quarter, the city shifted. Less light, more shadow, fewer assurances. Within it, routine remained intact. The Latin quarter represented a different response to uncertainty. Where the city adapted through caution, this place adapted through structure. As night approached, Manuel turned back. He did not linger. Some spaces were meant to be observed, not entered fully. Leaving the quarter, he felt the city's rhythm change once more. The familiar hush returned. Lamps grew sparse. Streets narrowed and twisted. Constantinople accepted the presence of this parallel world without resolution. It neither embraced nor rejected it. The division remained, quiet and unresolved. Manuel continued on his way, carrying with him the image of a city within a city, one built not on memory, but on preparation. Night settled more heavily than before. The sky above Constantinople darkened early, clouds drifting low and slow, pressing the city inward. Lanterns were lit sooner, their light cautious and contained. Manuel felt the change before he saw it. The streets quieted faster than usual. Movements shortened. People returned home earlier, closing doors with care, securing shutters as if the night itself required permission to enter. Near the outer districts, the gates drew attention. They stood massive and familiar, unchanged in stone and form. Yet their presence felt different. Guards gathered sooner than expected, their silhouettes steady against torchlight. The gates remained open, but readiness hung in the air. The city approached its edges carefully. Manuel passed nearby without slowing. He sensed no immediate threat, only anticipation. The kind that builds without direction, filling space simply by existing. Beyond the gates lay darkness. Not the darkness of sleep, but of distance and uncertainty. Roads disappeared quickly into shadow, leading away from the city's control and into places it could no longer predict. Inside the walls, people adjusted. Shops closed. Courtyards emptied. Sounds softened further until even footsteps seemed intrusive. The city prepared itself not for an event, but for the possibility of one. Manuel returned toward the center as the gates remained watched. No commands were given. No announcements made. The behavior spread naturally, carried by shared awareness rather than instruction. Constantinople had entered a waiting state. The guards held their positions as symbols more than sentinels. Their presence reassured without promising protection. The gates did not close, yet their openness felt conditional. As Manuel moved deeper into the city, the streets narrowed again. Here, night felt more familiar. Walls offered closeness. Lanterns burned low but steady. Sleep approached carefully. Manuel reached the monastery as the city settled into its deepest quiet. The building absorbed sound, its stone holding warmth from the day. Inside, stillness replaced vigilance. From within the walls, Constantinople remained awake in fragments. Eyes behind shutters, lamps behind curtains, breath measured and slow. The gates stayed where they were, open, watched, waiting, and the city rested not in peace, but in preparation. Morning returned with a muted light. The night withdrew quietly, leaving no clear trace of where it had ended. Constantinople emerged unchanged in shape, yet subtly altered in feeling, as if the city carried the memory of vigilance into the day. Manuel woke before the bells. The monastery was still, its corridors holding the cool air of early hours. He moved without haste, guided by routine rather than urgency. In the scriptorium, light filtered through narrow windows, settling gently on wooden tables and stacks of parchment. The familiar smell of ink and wax filled the room, steady and grounding. Here, the world felt contained, reduced to surfaces that could be touched and ordered. Manuel sat and prepared his tools. For a long moment, he did nothing. He allowed the stillness to settle, letting the rhythm of the city outside fade into background presence. Then he began to write, not records of rulers or decrees, not dates of victories or formal events. He wrote what endured quietly. He described the streets that emptied earlier each night, the doors marked with chalk, the squares that remained open yet unused, the harbor lights that burned steadily beyond the city's control, the careful way people moved, conserving energy, attention, trust. His writing was deliberate. Each line formed slowly without ornament. He did not interpret or judge. He observed. Manuel understood that these details mattered precisely because they lacked spectacle. They were not the moments history usually remembered. Yet they defined how the city lived. As the morning progressed, the scriptorium filled with soft sounds. Pages turning, tools placed down, footsteps passing beyond the walls. Life continued in measured tones. Manuel wrote of absence as well, of familiar presences no longer seen, of shops that remained closed without explanation, of routes that had fallen out of use. These were not losses announced publicly. They existed only to those who noticed. He paused occasionally, lifting his eyes from the page. Through the window, the city remained distant and calm. Nothing dramatic unfolded. And that, he realized, was precisely why the record was necessary. The city was changing without ceremony. By midday, the light had shifted. Shadows moved across the floor, marking time more clearly than any bell. Manuel continued, his pace steady, unbroken. He felt no urgency to finish. This was not a task to complete, but a process to maintain. Writing, like attention, required patience. What he set down was not a warning. It was a preservation. If the city could no longer guarantee its own continuity, memory would have to take on that role. As the afternoon approached, Manuel set his pen aside. The page before him was filled, not with conclusions, but with traces. He closed the book gently. Outside, Constantinople moved as it always had, carefully, quietly, adapting without acknowledgement. Within the walls, change continued without sound. Manuel rose and left the scriptorium, carrying nothing with him. What mattered had already been placed where it belonged. The fog returned quietly. It did not arrive suddenly, nor did it announce itself. It drifted in from the water, settling low and patient, softening the edges of the city once more. Constantinople accepted it without resistance. From above, the city appeared unchanged. Walls still stood. Streets followed their familiar lines. Domes rose against the pale sky. Yet within this stillness, movement continued, slow, deliberate, persistent. Manuel walked through the early morning streets. The city was already awake, though gently. People moved with purpose but without haste. Doors opened briefly, then closed. Goods were carried, exchanged, secured. Each action was small, contained, necessary. The fog muted sound. Footsteps faded quickly. Voices became indistinct. The city felt closer to itself, as though wrapped in a layer of quiet protection. Manuel thought of the city as a vessel, not broken, not whole, but carrying a slow, unseen leak. Each day, its people responded without discussion. They did not attempt to seal the breach entirely. Instead, they lifted small buckets, habits, routines, acts of care, and removed the water as best they could. A baker opening an oven, a guard standing at a familiar post, a child watching the movement of strangers, a scribe writing what others overlooked. None of these acts were grand. Together, they allowed the city to remain afloat. Manuel passed through a narrow street where the fog gathered thickly. Here, buildings leaned closer, enclosing the path. The world felt reduced to stone, breath, and motion. He found comfort in the containment. The city did not rush toward the future. It waited. Waiting did not mean surrender. It meant endurance. As Manuel reached the monastery, the bells began to ring, softly, evenly. The sound traveled only a short distance before dissolving into the fog. Constantinople continued to exist within its walls, not as a center of power, not as a certainty, but as a place where life persisted through attention and restraint. The fog held the city gently, obscuring its weaknesses and smoothing its outlines. For a moment, everything felt suspended, balanced between what had been lost and what remained. Manuel stepped inside, leaving the streets behind. Outside, the city carried on, lifting its small buckets, one day at a time. And for now, that was enough.